Hello, I'm Paul Orselli, President and Chief Instigator at Paul Orselli Workshop here on Long Island. And I am doubly excited and doubly happy today to be speaking with two guests from different parts of the world. So hopefully technology participates and cooperates. I'd like to say hello to Amparo, Leyman Pino. Hi, Amparo.
Hi, Paul. How are you? Thank
I'm
you so
well.
much for inviting me again.
And Amparo's colleague, and we will find out, co-author Piotr Bienkowski. How are you, Piotr?
I'm very well, Paul. Thank you for having me, and greetings to everyone from southern Scotland.
Wow, we are all over the map today. Barcelona, Long Island, and southern Scotland. And we have a interesting and timely set of topics for our discussion today that start with a project that Ampis and Piotr are working on, a book project. Let's see, the book in preparation is called Inclusion, Power, and Influence in Cultural Organizations. Wow, there's a lot of territory to cover there. Um, but before we start covering that territory, I always like to give people a chance to get a little context of who we're talking with today. So maybe, Piotr, you could start us off. Give us a little bit about your background.
Thank you, Paul. Well, my disciplinary background is in archaeology, especially working in Jordan, and I still do that. But I've been a museum curator, a museum director, a university professor, a consultant. And for the last 15 years or so in my consultancy, I've been focusing on organizational change and leadership and participatory and diversity and inclusive work. And in the last few years, I've published a couple of books on those topics, one on managing change in museums and galleries, and just recently one on cultural leadership, which Ampis, in fact, wrote the foreword for.
Ah, well, thank you. Obviously, a man who wears and has worn many hats. Good to have you here. And Ampis, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and then we'll launch into the discussion.
Sure. Well, I started my career in museums 31 years ago as an explainer on floor at the Children's Museum in Mexico City, Papalote, Museo del Niño. And from working on floor with children, I went to be part of the exhibits department. Then I started consulting for the museum because I wanted to do other things. Amongst those, I've been a counselor for high school students. I co-founded an elementary school in Mexico City. And then when I moved to the US 18 years ago, I continue consulting all over the world, and I've been doing developing inclusive learning experiences for museums, science centers, cultural organizations, universities, educational nonprofits. And yeah, and recently I was honored to become the new director of interpretive programs at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. But we have a book to write, Piotr and I. And yeah, and I've been writing some essays on inclusion because also my practice has been focused on inclusion and helping organizations to become more inclusive. So I have a couple of essays published in some edited books, but now it's a book with Piotr about inclusion, power, and influence.
Well, thank you both. Let's start maybe with what your book will be about and what we will be able to take away from that book when it is published, but what you are learning and thinking about now related to both your practices and this book that seems very timely No matter where you are in the world these days in cultural institutions, and especially since I'm speaking here from the United States, seems especially timely. So maybe Piotr again, if tell us a little bit about what your thinking is going into this book. Why you and Amparo wanted to put a book together on this topic?
Okay. I'm actually going to, I'll answer your question briefly. I'm going to pass most of it over to Ampis. It was
Okay.
her idea in the first place, and
Okay.
she is the senior author. Um, the reason we wanted to do it together is because we realized that we both want to see the same outcomes in cultural organizations and that we have the same set of values, but as individuals and in terms of our practice, the way we do things is actually different. And we felt that those differences would actually enrich a book such as this. Um, my One of the things I've been arguing for many years in the projects that I run is that for inclusion, diversity, any sort of participatory practice to be firmly embedded in an organization, it has to be everyone's job in the organization. It's no good just having one person or one group. It's got to be everyone's job. And the subtitle of the book, the main title, as you said, is Inclusion, Power and Influence in Cultural Organizations. The subtitle is How Everyone Can Make a Difference. So that is building on that sense I've had for a long time that everybody has to be involved. I'll pass over to Ampis for a different lens through which to see our book.
Well, that's great. I just want to say briefly before Ampis expands on your response, I love the notion that you both want similar outcomes, but you are coming at the challenges or the problems using slightly different lenses. When I think about exhibits, I think there's never just one right answer to develop an exhibit or a
Yeah.
museum program. So I love that you gave that answer. All right, Amparo, tell us a little bit more about the motivation for this book.
Yeah, I don't know where to start because I have too many ideas in my head, but I think the one easy one to put it is that through my Fulbright specialist project, I had a 4-year tenure, and I worked very deeply with two organizations through my Fulbright, Technorama in Switzerland and Experimentarium in Denmark. And in between, I was also working with the New Children's Museum in San Diego. Three similar projects, right, of helping the organizations from the ground up to take off and we have this idea, right? And how are we going to do it? And do these three projects almost parallel, almost, but not precisely, gave me the one proof of concept of a framework that I've been working on, which goes on creating awareness in the organization and then taking that awareness into practice, from practice to agency, and then from agency to empathy. And when I see it 3 times in 3 different places, right, that they don't know each other, they don't talk to each other much, then you see that there's something that you can give to others as a method to leverage, right? So when Piotr and I, we were talking about how we practice the same in a different way, I was telling him, well, I need to learn from you. And he was like, I need to learn from you. Well, maybe the book that you owe me, Piotr, should be about this. So he owes me a book, so now we're writing it. But the point is that we wanted to give to the field this knowledge that we have collected working with these organizations that are very different from each other, but they're going through a process parallel but not the same. So that will enrich someone somewhere, and that's where we're coming from.
Well, I love that answer too, because you're giving people, it sounds like, different tools or possibilities to consider. And again, there's not just a one size fits all solution to these challenges. Um,
Yeah.
I'm gonna throw you a little bit of a hard question that's based on what you've already told me, because you have indicated that this is really everyone's job across an institution. It's not just, oh, we have a DEAI, we have a diversity and inclusion department or a VP of diversity or what have you. This is everyone's uh, job across the organization. Now, I'm just going to say something that is, I'm sure you both can acknowledge. There are times that people across an organization, a cultural organization, and maybe these times in particular, feel a little bit beaten down. The like the world, this is a, like, I agree, this is my job no matter where I am in the org chart. But how do I do this? I don't feel like I am empowered. I'm going to use that word, but maybe you both feel differently. So if this really is everyone's job in an organization, share a few insights or share a few takeaways that people watching this who feel like, well, okay, I agree with this in principle, but how do I do this in practice?
Yeah. Do you want me to start, Piotr?
I thought you might start because Paul used the word empowered, and I thought you
Yeah,
might want to say something about that.
yeah, sure. I will say two things. The first one is not about what you're doing in your work, is how you do it. So then I will go back to the projects that I was mentioning, and I work with every department of every organization I've been with or working with, and from the floor staff, the people who are in charge of the maintenance and cleanliness of the museum, etc. All of everyone has something to contribute for the inclusion of that organization. So it's not about what you do only, is how you do your job. And again, I'm gonna go back to the awareness, because you need to know and be very clear on that connection between your role at your organization and doing it with this lens in order to provoke that, right? Because again, it's not somebody else's project within the organization, it's something that we're carrying it together. And I was very impressed at the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry. I was in a conversation with the CEO, and she was giving this anecdote that there was a person from the maintenance team onboarding a new team member, and this man was explaining, these are our goals and we want to be inclusive because of this and that. So it's in everyone's uh, job description, not on be or behave this way, but rather we have to put this lens in our work. And the second thing is use your power, right? Where we are trying to inspire others or to ignite in people is that you already have power. So use it, right? Now, DAI is being at stake all the time, right? Or most of the time. And we know that there are a lot of people who work on this arena despite anything, right? Sometimes under the radar, as Piotr has mentioned it before in our conversations, and they do the job, right? So here is, you have power. You can use it, untap it, right? Give people the opportunity to use that power to do their job that way, right? In your know-how. But Piotr, I don't know what else you want to add to this.
Well, actually, Piotr, I'm gonna just throw you a little slight curveball here because I agree in principle with everything that you and Amparo said, and that everyone in the organization should feel a sense of empowerment and a collective goal and raising the organization towards things. But I'm just wondering a little bit about this notion of being under the radar. And the reason I ask that question is um, sometimes, and we see it now in the United States specifically, sometimes being under the radar can inadvertently run into notions of self-censorship, like we are so worried that we're going to offend some official dictate that we stop doing or we preempt doing programs or exhibits or community outreach. So I just want maybe you could triangulate that a little bit. I gave you a messy curveball to deal with, but maybe you could respond to
You
that.
actually sent me several curveballs, and I'll try and remember which ones to try and catch. I'm going to take the second part first about people maybe doing some self-censorship, etc. Um, in my work with all sorts of different cultural organizations, and that it's not only museums and art galleries, but orchestras and community arts trusts, there's very often a tension between especially raising money or spending time on funding applications and this sort of inclusion, diversity, participatory work. And the key is always to disentangle what are ends of the organization and what are means. I usually use much simpler language. I say this is a what-how distinction. What is it that the organization is there to do, and how is it going to do it? And if the generating of income through all sorts of different ways, or the generating of greater audience numbers takes precedence over actually what the organization is there to do, you begin to wonder, have you got the balance wrong? So when it comes to things like self-censorship, I would say always go back to the what-how distinction. What are we actually here to do? Yes, the landscape, the political landscape, the funding landscape may be shifting, and therefore how we do it is different. But do we really want to compromise what we are there to do just because there may be short-term, hopefully a short-term blip in what's going on in the environment? Always make that distinction between what and how, between ends and means. And to try and catch another of your curveballs, this notion of working under the radar. This is something that I've been coming across for many, many years, going back 15, 20 more years, that there were some organizations or some CEOs or some boards of trustees who were uncomfortable about strategically committing to some sort of inclusive or diversity work, or working with certain community groups, or having an active participatory program. And yet there were staff in the organization who were having conversations with communities and felt there was something they needed to do. There was some way they needed to respond. So they use slightly different language. They don't use the language that is likely to provoke resistance. They would badge work that they were doing under community work, or welcoming, belonging, or generating audiences, or sometimes saying, well, we're going to do a pilot project, because pilot projects usually don't threaten people quite so much. And what I found almost invariably in these instances is that that even though this was under radar, it wasn't a big strategic announcement. This organization is going to do this sort of work. They were just slowly doing work with different groups. The perception that these groups had of the museum or the other organization started to change. You could see this sort of work was happening. And there's a sort of domino effect also within the organization. People can see, actually, this is working. We're getting sort of positive feedback. We're getting good results, good impact with these audiences. And slowly it actually percolates through. And even those in power, as it were, those who make the decisions, the CEOs, the boards of trustees, begin to realize this is perhaps not as much of a threat as we thought, because we're getting very good responses.
It's interesting. It's maybe a little bit paradoxical, or maybe not. Like maybe the thing is to just get on with doing the good work, the what's, and not make a big pronouncement and not say, here, look what we're doing, and just get on with it and engage with people. That's you handled those curveballs deftly, Piotr. Thank you.
And,
Um,
and actually, just to respond to what you've said there, something I very often hear from people who are like community partners to cultural organizations is, yes, start small, just start doing things. You don't have to start big.
yeah,
And sometimes that's better.
yeah. Well, you used a word. I'm gonna give Amparo an opportunity here. You used the word belonging, which I think is a very powerful word in this context. And I think this notion of belonging, well, Amparo, I'll throw that word to you and let you play with that word, because I think belonging, when I mentioned it, both your and Piotr's faces lit up, because you want the communities that an organization serves to feel like this is our museum. This is like I am engaged with this. So how can we lean into that notion of belonging? And when does it start? Where's the demarc in terms of belonging, Amparo?
Yeah, this is a beautiful question, because actually my last essay that was published this January 2025 was precisely talking about this relationship between institutions or museums in particular and communities, right? That sometimes we're talking about like museum and communities, like if the museum is not part of the community that they belong to, right? And therefore the people in that community, vice versa, right? They don't feel that they belong to the museum. So when we actually erase those barriers, when we say things such as, this is your museum, the museum is part of this community, this museum is serving the neighborhood X in this city, this museum is serving childhood in this state. I'm just thinking about my country, for in Mexico, for example, that we have created. I've been part of the creation of 12, 17 new museums in my country. And it's always like, well, Bebe Leche in Durango is to serve the children of Durango, right? And if there are people from other states, Coahuila, which is very close, right? Or Nuevo León, etc., welcome, right? Everybody's welcome. But institutions have an intentionality, and they're rooted, right, in a place. And this is kind of parochial, right? You need to serve that territory with the culture, with the content, and make people feel welcome. And now that's another part of belonging, right? Because belonging starts way before you come to the museum. Belonging comes from, yeah, this is a chain of accessibility. I'm not saying anything new, right? But it comes from the moment the person is thinking going somewhere, right? Okay, what are we gonna do this weekend? What are we gonna do for your birthday? What are we gonna do this week, because perhaps it's a retired person who has all the time in their hands, right? So from that moment that you're making that decision, where to go, what are my options, you are thinking of going to a place that you want to be, that you want to be part of. And some people, for example, think of the museum, their children's museum, like an extension of their homes or their schools or their community centers or their libraries, right? It's not just, the museum is not isolated, it's connected. And therefore, connected with who, right? Who is connected with a museum? Precisely the families, the people that are there. So belonging is this thing that I am part of it, right? And of course, there are museums that have membership, some others don't. And that doesn't mean that there's no such a clear contract of belonging to that museum. All the contrary, right? It's something about pride and connection, right? I can tell you that with the Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, because it speaks about my culture, right? And our ancestors. Then I feel part of it. And when people say like, oh my God, I love the Museum of Anthropology. Have you worked with them? Like, no, but it's my museum. I love it, right? I feel connected with it.
Sure. Piotr, do you want to pick up on any of those aspects of belonging?
Hmm. Well, I'd point out that the annual conference of the UK's Museums Association later this year, it's the oldest museums association in the world, the theme of it is belonging. And I
Ah,
actually only found this out two days ago. So I've not pinched the idea from them. I'd like to think it's the other way around, but it's a big theme. This understanding that museums are there to serve the community. And I, several years ago now, I directed what in the UK was the biggest organizational change program in the museum sector. And it was about participation and inclusion. And we called it Our Museum because the end result, the impact was supposed to be that people who were the audience or the communities of those particular museums would feel exactly what Ampis has been saying. This is our museum, and it's part of our community. And an important part of this is for the museum or other cultural organization not to make decisions about what they're doing in isolation. It's to think about what are the community agendas? What can the museum do for the community? Not only we want the community to come to the museum, and so our figure numbers and our audience numbers and our income is increased. It's also the other way around, that it's a quid pro quo. Belonging goes both ways.
awesome. Well, I love both the optimistic and practical nature of this conversation. And I would like to give you each an opportunity to call out one thing that you would like people who are watching this video to like give them one thing to grab onto, give them one idea that will tie into both that optimism and practicality so that they feel like, yeah, I can do that. I want to do that. So I'll give you a moment to ponder, but I'm going to give you each an opportunity to drive us home with an optimistic and practical piece. Who would like to start? Who has one in mind, or more than one in mind?
I can start
Okay.
because also the times that we're living, right? It calls for optimism and practicality, right? They don't look very optimistic, the times that we're living. All over the world. I don't want to say in the US only, right? But it makes me think about being reactive, which could be an option. And the other one is to be strategic. And I remember in 2020, with the death of George Floyd, many organizations started being reactive, right? Trying to, oh, we need to say something about this, and we need to have a statement about inclusion and where we're standing for, without having a conversation, an internal conversation, and backing up those statements with the whole organization, right? What Piotr was saying about this is participatory and this is something that we want to do, everyone, and understanding, with all the respect with our colleagues and organizations, many did an effort to say something, many published their statements without asking their organization, staff, boards, patrons, where are they, right? And here is the same moment, right? We cannot be reactive. So that's a practical aspect of this. Say something, do something, but be strategic. Gather whoever is your stakeholder, people that you trust, that will support you no matter what, and have these hard conversations and be strategic of what you can do. And again, from your place of power and influence in your community, in your city, in your neighborhood. It doesn't have to be, as Piotr was saying, something huge and disruptive. It could be very small and targeted, but strategic. And there's a possibility that will ignite or create a domino effect with whoever you want, perhaps another institution, and then you join forces. That's my optimistic, right, self. Or perhaps is with your local authorities and create awareness, right? But then practice awareness, practice awareness, practice. It's never ending. But be strategic, not just reactive. That will be one of the things that comes into mind with this conversation.
And Piotr, I'm going to give you the last word for this conversation. Give people watching this something to latch onto.
So I'm sort of going to expand on what Ampis has said, but also go back to some of the things that we were saying earlier. So we've talked about belonging, and we've talked about cultural organizations and museums being welcoming and places that people feel they belong to. I wonder if this is also a time for us all to reflect, because belonging is about belonging for everyone. And there seems to be a perception that diversity and inclusion programs are being targeted or cut because they are perceived as targeting or aimed at just particular communities or particular groups. And therefore, there are other groups who feel, well, this funding, whether it's local funding, tax funding, federal funding, is going to those groups. It's not coming to me. And of course, we understand why we're doing this, because we're working with marginalized groups who've not been included before. But have we done something wrong because there is the perception that, in fact, inclusion diversity is about particular groups? Let's remember, it's about belonging for everyone. And let's maybe use some of this time to reflect, what could we have done differently to make sure that everybody who has this, what we feel is a wrong perception about inclusion diversity, could we have done different things to make them feel as if they belong? Because it is about everybody. It's not just the people who are targeted by our inclusion and diversity programs. It's everyone. So as an organization, as individuals, can we spend this time thinking it's maybe not only the fault of the lack of funding, maybe we've done some things wrong. And I'll go back to the idea that it should be everybody's job in the organization. And we've known this for a long time, 10 or 15 years, that actually for these things to be embedded in an organization, it should be everybody's job. If it had been everybody's job, then the impact of what's happening now, especially in the United States, would be much less because everybody would be doing it anyway. And there may not be any need for roles with diversity and inclusion in the titles because everybody's doing it anyway. So that's something maybe to reflect on. I'm throwing everybody a curveball of my own there. But the second thing is, again, building on what Ampis has said, for everybody to think about what power do I have in the organization? Things may be crashing around me. We're losing posts, we're losing funding, but I have power. What can I do to actually, just in my role, to pursue these ideas of inclusion and diversity? And it doesn't have to be a big strategic thing. It could just be a small step. What can I actually do? That is actually a confidence builder because people realize, yes, I actually do have power. I do have influence. I can do something. And I'm going to go in, 9 o'clock in the morning, and I'm going to do X. And maybe X will lead to Y, and Y will lead to Z.
Well, I love this conversation, curveballs included. And I really appreciate we could have a whole nother video about one of those last curveballs that you gave us, Piotr. But for now, we'll leave it here. And I really appreciate both of you, Piotr and Amparo, taking the time to talk with me today. I will mention, since this will ultimately end up on YouTube, if we have resources or links that you would like to share related to this broader conversation, including about your essays and publications, we can include them in the description below. But for now, again, many thanks, Amparo and Piotr.
And thank you,
Thank you
Paul, as well.
for,
Thank you.
yeah, yeah, you're always very generous to have this conversation with a lot of colleagues, and we learn a lot from them. Thank you.
Thanks.